The afternoon sun poured through the tall glass windows of the city train station. People moved in every direction, some rushing to catch their trains, others slowly dragging suitcases behind them, their faces tired after a long day. Amid the noise of rolling wheels, loudspeaker announcements, and hurried footsteps, there stood an old man near a black upright piano tucked in one corner of the platform. His gray hair shone under the light, and his coat looked a little too big for his small, thin frame. He was 75, though his eyes still carried the kind of spark you see in someone who hasn't stopped dreaming. He carried himself quietly, politely stepping aside whenever someone brushed past him. On his right hand he wore a gold wedding band, worn, scratched, but still shining faintly. He placed a small bag down beside the piano and looked at the instrument as though greeting an old friend. For a moment, he simply stood there, lost in thought. Then he lifted the piano cover slowly, brushing a thin layer of dust off the keys. His hands hovered over them, shaky at first. His fingers, long and bony, trembled as they pressed a single note. The sound echoed faintly through the hall. A soft smile appeared on his face. He pressed another key, then another, until a gentle tune began to form, a melody from long ago. It wasn't a loud or showy tune. It was calm, thoughtful, and beautiful in a way that made people slow down without realizing it. A few travelers turned their heads, drawn by the sound. A little boy pointed at the old man, tugging at his mother's coat. A couple waiting for their train stopped chatting for a moment, listening quietly. The old man, his name was Harold, closed his eyes and kept playing. For him, music wasn't just sound. It was memory. Each note carried pieces of his life. The classroom where he had once taught children to play. The small house where his late wife used to hum along while cooking. The empty nights when he sat by the window, his piano being his only company. As he played, he forgot where he was. He wasn't an old man standing in a busy station anymore. He was back in his small town hall, 40 years younger, surrounded by music students laughing, clapping, asking him to play just one more piece. The melody deepened, becoming livelier, full of heart. The piano wasn't perfect. Some keys were out of tune and the sound was slightly muffled, but somehow that made it even more beautiful. It sounded real, honest, human. Then, suddenly, a voice interrupted. "Excuse me, sir," said a man in a blue uniform, stepping closer. "I'm sorry, but you can't play that right now." Harold looked up, his fingers freezing mid-note. The crowd noise rushed back in around him.
"I can't?"
he asked softly, almost in disbelief. The guard, a tall man who looked younger than Harold by at least 40 years, shifted awkwardly. "It's not allowed unless you have a performance permit," he explained. "The piano's for scheduled players only. It's part of the station's event program." "Oh," Harold murmured, lowering his eyes. "I didn't know." A few people nearby frowned. A woman who had been recording with her phone quietly stopped. The little boy who had been watching whispered to his mother, "Why can't he play anymore?" The guard gave Harold a polite but firm smile. "I'm really sorry, sir. It's just the rule." Harold nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He had never been the type to cause trouble. With shaky hands, he gently closed the piano cover, the sound of the wood clicking softly as it shut. He picked up his small bag and looked at the piano one last time as if saying goodbye. "It's all right," he said in a quiet voice that almost got lost in the noise around him. "I understand." Then he turned and began to walk away. The music had stopped. The crowd dispersed. The usual sounds of the station took over again. The announcements, the trains, the footsteps. It was as if the little moment of magic that had just filled the place had been erased, like chalk washed off a blackboard. Harold walked toward a bench near the platform, his steps slow and heavy. He sat down carefully, resting his hands on his knees. He could still feel the keys under his fingers, still hear the melody in his head even though it had been cut short. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired in the way people look when they've been holding on to something for too long. He thought of the days when playing the piano had been his life. He had started when he was 8, on a small chipped instrument that his father had bought secondhand. Every day after school he would play until the sun went down, his fingers chasing notes like they were secrets only he could uncover. Years later, he became a music teacher, then a performer in small local events. Music had always been his way of connecting with the world. But as time passed, the world changed. Students grew up and moved on, His performances became fewer. His wife, the one who had always encouraged him to keep playing, fell ill and eventually passed away. The piano at home sat silent for months after that. Sometimes he would lift the cover, look at the keys, and then close it again without playing a note. It hurt too much. Until one day, while walking through the train station, he saw the public piano. It was painted with bright colors and had a small sign that read, "Play Me." Something about it made him smile. He sat down and played for the first time in years. No one stopped him that day. In fact, people had clapped. A young woman even thanked him, saying his music reminded her of her late grandfather. That moment had stayed with him. So when he returned today, he thought maybe it would be the same. Maybe he could share one small piece of himself with strangers again. But now, as he sat watching people rush past, he realized the world didn't have time for old melodies anymore. A young couple sat down a few seats away from him, whispering softly. A man scrolled through his phone, tapping quickly. Everyone seemed connected to something, but not each other. Harold sighed and looked down at his hands. His fingers had begun to stiffen over the past few years. The doctor had told him it was arthritis. He tried not to think about how much harder it would soon be to play. He took a small photo out of his coat pocket. It was faded, the edges bent. It showed a young man, him, standing beside a woman with kind eyes, both smiling next to a piano. It had been taken decades ago after one of his concerts. He touched the photo gently with his thumb. "You'd probably tell me to play anyway," he whispered to it, smiling faintly. A few minutes later, the same guard walked by again. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked, his tone softer this time. "Yes," Harold replied, forcing a polite smile. "Just resting a bit before I catch my train." The guard nodded. "You play beautifully," he said quietly, as if making up for before. Harold's eyes lit up for a moment. "Thank you," he said simply. After the guard left, Harold sat in silence. Then, almost without thinking, he began tapping his fingers gently on his knee, following the rhythm of the song he hadn't finished. He could hear it clearly in his mind, the rise and fall of the melody, the harmony that had once filled whole rooms. A little girl passing by noticed and stopped. "Grandpa, are you playing the piano on your leg?" she asked with a small giggle. Harold looked up and smiled. "Something like that," he said softly. "Sometimes when you can't play the real one, you just play where you can." The girl laughed and waved before her mother gently pulled her along. As the station lights flickered and the next train rolled in, Harold slowly stood up. He adjusted his coat and picked up his bag. Before leaving, he looked back one last time at the piano sitting silently in the corner. He didn't resent it. He didn't even resent the rules. Deep down, he knew there would come another day, another place, another chance. He walked toward the platform doors, the sound of the city growing louder outside. Behind him, the piano sat quietly waiting for the next person brave enough to play it. What Harold didn't know was that someone had been watching him the entire time, a young traveler standing across the hall, eyes filled with curiosity and a strange sense of recognition. She hadn't just heard the notes he played. She had felt them. And soon, because of that, his quiet melody would find its way back into the world in a way neither of them could have imagined. The sound of the train pulling into the station filled the air, metal grinding against metal, brakes screeching as it slowed to a stop. People hurried forward, their footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. But one person didn't move. She stood across the platform, still staring at the old piano. Her ticket was in her hand, her suitcase beside her, but her attention wasn't on her journey anymore. It was on the man who had just been told to stop playing. Her name was Emily, a 26-year-old traveler heading back home after visiting her grandparents. She had been standing near the vending machine when she first heard the music. It was soft, full of feeling, the kind of melody that makes you stop without even realizing why. She had turned curious, and there he was, and an old man completely lost in his music. At first, she hadn't planned to listen. She was in a hurry, but something about his playing held her in place. It wasn't just the tune. It was the way his face softened with every note, the way his shoulders relaxed and how his eyes closed like he was somewhere far away. It was the kind of music that made you forget everything for a few minutes. And then the guard came. Emily watched the moment unfold. The gentle argument, the man's quiet nod, the way he packed up and walked away without a word. Something about it broke her heart a little. He didn't look angry or bitter. He just looked defeated. She stayed where she was, watching him sit on a bench, his shoulders slightly hunched. The crowd around him had already moved on. The piano sat silently again, and the moment of warmth that had filled the station was gone. Emily felt a lump in her throat. She didn't even know why. She didn't know the man, had never seen him before, yet something about him felt familiar. Not his face, but his music. She glanced at the piano again. It sat there, still and quiet, waiting. Without thinking too much, she took a small step toward it. Then another. She looked around. No one seemed to notice her. The guard was talking to another passenger near the information desk. The train she was supposed to board had already started loading, but she didn't move toward it. She walked straight to the piano. Her hand hovered over the cover for a moment. She hesitated. What if she got told off too? What if she wasn't good enough? It had been years since she'd played in front of anyone. But something inside her whispered, "Do it." She slowly lifted the cover. The keys glowed softly under the station lights. She sat down on the bench, her heart beating faster. Her fingers rested on the keys. For a few seconds she just sat there, thinking about the tune the old man had played. She remembered it clearly. Every rise and fall, every small pause. She could still hear it echoing in her head. Then she began to play. The sound filled the hall again, the same gentle melody that had just been silenced. Only now it continued from where he had stopped. The notes flowed smoothly, almost as if the two of them had planned it together. People nearby turned their heads again. A few of them smiled in surprise. Harold, still sitting on the bench, looked up. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The same song, his song, and was playing again. He turned his head toward the piano, his eyes narrowing slightly as if to make sure he wasn't imagining it. And there she was, a young woman sitting at the same bench playing his tune perfectly. Every note was right. Every emotion, every pause felt exactly how he had meant it when he wrote it years ago. He stood up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He walked a few steps closer, his eyes fixed on her hands. The way her fingers moved, quick but gentle, reminded him of someone. Emily kept playing, completely unaware of the small crowd forming again. People had stopped to listen. Some took out their phones. Others simply stood still, their faces softening as the music wrapped around them. The melody grew stronger, filled with emotion, sadness, warmth, love, and hope, all blended into one. Emily closed her eyes and let her hands move freely. It wasn't just a song to her. It was a memory. When she was a child, she had taken piano lessons for years. Her first teacher had been kind and patient, always telling her, "Music isn't about the notes, it's about what's between them." She had loved that line so much she wrote it in her old music notebook. But life got busy, school, work, friends, and she had stopped playing, until today. When she heard the old man's melody, something inside her had stirred. The rhythm, the tone, even the emotion behind it. It all felt like something from her childhood, something she had once known deeply but forgotten. The piece came to an end with a soft, final chord. The sound lingered for a moment before fading away completely. Then the hall erupted into gentle applause. A few people even cheered. Emily opened her eyes, startled. She hadn't realized she'd drawn so many listeners. Her cheeks turned pink. She gave a small, shy smile and stood up to leave. But before she could walk away, she saw him. The old man stood just a few steps away, watching her with watery eyes. He looked like he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. She hesitated. I'm sorry," she said softly, thinking maybe she had broken the rules too. But before she could finish, the old man lifted a trembling hand and said quietly, "That song. Where did you learn it?" Emily blinked. "I didn't learn it," she said honestly. "I just heard you playing earlier. I think I remembered it." He stared at her for a long moment. His lips parted and a faint smile appeared. "Remembered it?" he repeated softly. "But that melody, it's not a song you can find anywhere." Her eyes widened slightly. "It's yours?" He nodded slowly. "I wrote it. A long time ago." Something in her chest tightened. "Then how?" she began but stopped. She didn't know how to explain it. It was as if the music had found its way into her somehow, like an old dream she couldn't quite recall. The guard from before walked toward them again, but this time He didn't say anything. He just watched quietly as the two stood by the piano, surrounded by curious onlookers. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The trains, the announcements, the footsteps, and all faded into the background. It was just the two of them and the piano between them. The old man finally spoke again, his voice trembling slightly. "You played it exactly how I used to," he said. "Every note, even the small pause before the ending. Only someone who truly understood it could do that." Emily looked down at her hands, unsure of what to say. "It just felt right," she said softly, "like it was already inside me somehow." He smiled, a mixture of sadness and wonder in his eyes. "Maybe it was," he whispered. A few people nearby wiped tears from their eyes. They didn't know the full story, but they didn't need to. They could feel the emotion. Two strangers connected through one piece of music that spoke louder than words ever could. The crowd began to applaud again, louder this time. The guard smiled and said quietly, "You can keep playing, sir, and you too, miss." The old man laughed softly. "I think she plays it better than I ever did," he said. Emily shook her head. "No," she said with a small smile. "I just finished what you started." They both laughed quietly. The tension between them melted away, replaced by something warm and gentle. The moment felt timeless. A young woman and an old man standing beside a worn piano in a busy station, sharing something pure, something human. After a while, the crowd began to thin out. People went back to catching their trains, still smiling as they passed. But the memory of the music lingered in the air. Emily picked up her suitcase, ready to leave. The old man nodded politely, his eyes still soft with gratitude. "Thank you," he said. She paused. "For what?" "For reminding me that my music isn't forgotten," he said quietly. "That it still has life." She smiled and nodded. "It'll never be forgotten," she said. "Not as long as people like you keep playing it." Then she turned toward the train doors. But just before she stepped inside, she looked back one last time. The old man had sat down again at the piano. He lifted the cover, placed his fingers on the keys, and began to play, this time with tears in his eyes but a smile on his face. The melody rose again, joined by the faint hum of the train engines blending into something beautiful. And as the train began to move, Emily watched from the window, her eyes glistening. She didn't know it yet, but that small, simple moment would soon travel far beyond that station. Someone had recorded everything, and the world was about to hear their story. The train disappeared down the tracks, leaving behind a quiet hum that slowly faded away. The station returned to its usual rhythm, announcements, hurried footsteps, voices echoing. Yet for the few people who had stopped to listen earlier, something about the air still felt different. The old man sat quietly at the piano, his hands resting on the keys even after the young woman had gone. For a long moment he didn't play. He just sat there, letting the memory of the last few minutes sink in. It felt unreal. A stranger had just played his forgotten song, a melody he hadn't heard anyone else play in decades. He thought about the way she had looked at him, surprised, yet deeply moved, as though the music had touched something inside her too. It wasn't just coincidence. There had been something about her that felt familiar. He pressed a few keys softly, replaying the ending she had played. Her version had felt alive. Not perfect, but full of emotion. It reminded him of how he used to play when he was young and still believed music could heal the world. A few bystanders still lingered nearby, whispering to each other. One of them, a man holding a camera, stepped forward and said, "Sir, that was beautiful. I hope you don't mind, I recorded the whole thing." The old man looked up, startled. "You did?" "Yes," the man said with a smile. "People should hear it. It was special." The old man didn't quite know what to say. He had never cared much about cameras or attention, but the man's tone was kind, genuine. "All right," he said quietly. "If you think it'll help someone, I don't mind." The man nodded and walked away, still smiling. The old man, Harold, turned back to the piano. His fingers brushed the keys again and he began to play softly. Not the same tune this time, but another, slower, simpler. A melody of gratitude. Each note floated through the station like a whisper of peace. Across the hall, a small group gathered again to listen. Even the guard who had stopped him earlier stood near the wall, pretending to check his radio but really just listening. The music didn't need words to explain what it meant. It was about second chances, about being seen again after years of silence. By the time Harold finished, a few people clapped quietly. He smiled, nodded politely, and stood up. His knees ached, but his heart felt light. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. Outside the station, the evening sun had begun to set, painting the city in shades of gold and orange. Harold walked slowly toward the bus stop, his small bag swinging at his side. He didn't have much, just some food, a notebook, and an old photo, but he carried something far more valuable now: hope. As he waited for the bus, he looked up at the sky. "You'd be proud of me," he whispered, thinking of his late wife. "I played again," he smiled to himself, unaware that far away on a stranger's phone, the video of that very moment was already being uploaded online. That night, in a small apartment on the other side of town, Emily sat on her couch with a cup of tea in her hands. The events of the day replayed in her mind again and again. The music, the old man's smile, the feeling she couldn't quite explain. She had almost missed her train because of that song, but she didn't regret it. Something about him had touched her deeply. It wasn't pity, and it was admiration. He had played with such honesty that it made her remember why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. After putting her cup down, she opened her laptop. Out of curiosity, she typed a few words into the search bar. "Old man playing piano in train station." At first, nothing appeared. Then a few minutes later, a new video popped up, uploaded just an hour ago. The title read, "Elderly man and young woman play a heart-touching duet at train station." Her eyes widened. "Someone filmed it?" she whispered to herself. She clicked on the video. The screen showed the scene exactly as she remembered. The old man's trembling hands, the moment he stopped, the guard stepping in. Then came her part, her sitting at the piano, finishing his melody, and the quiet exchange between them. The camera had caught it all. She watched it all the way through. By the time it ended, her eyes were wet. The comments had already started coming in. People from all over the world writing things like, "This made my day," and "So much emotion in one song," and "That old man is a legend." A few comments even asked, "Who are they? What's the story behind this?" Emily smiled softly. She didn't know how to answer that herself. All she knew was that something powerful had happened that day, something worth remembering. She scrolled through the video again, pausing on the moment the old man looked at her. There was so much emotion in his eyes, sadness, pride, and recognition all at once. She wondered what kind of life he'd lived, what stories his music carried. After a few minutes, she closed her laptop and walked over to her small keyboard near the window. It had been collecting dust for months. She wiped it gently, sat down, and began to play the same melody, the old man's song. The sound wasn't perfect, but it filled the small apartment with warmth. Halfway through, she stopped and smiled to herself. "Maybe music really does find its way back," she whispered. The next morning, the world woke up to the video. It had spread overnight, from social media feeds to news sites, gathering millions of views within hours. People shared it with captions like, "The most beautiful thing you'll see today," and "Proof that music connects generations." Reporters started asking who the man and woman were. Some even called the station, hoping to find them. Harold, however, didn't know any of this yet. He didn't own a smartphone. His mornings were simple: breakfast, a short walk, maybe a visit to the park. When he reached the local cafe he often went to, the owner smiled widely. "You're famous," she said, holding up her phone. He looked puzzled. "Famous?" She showed him the video. "This is you, isn't it?" He leaned closer, his eyes widening as he saw himself on the small screen. "Oh my." People around the cafe turned to look. Someone said, "That's him, the man from the piano video." Harold chuckled softly. "Well, I'll be." He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He never thought the small moment he shared with that young woman would travel so far. The cafe owner placed a cup of tea in front of him and said, "You've touched a lot of hearts, you know. Everyone's talking about you." He smiled, shaking his head in disbelief. "I only wanted to play a little music," she nodded. "And you did. But sometimes a little music is all the world needs." He spent the rest of the morning watching short clips of people reacting to his song. Children trying to play it on their own pianos, old musicians praising his passion, and strangers saying they cried watching it. By noon, he finally put the phone down, feeling overwhelmed but grateful. He looked out the cafe window and whispered, "Thank you," to no one in particular. Meanwhile, Emily's phone hadn't stopped buzzing all morning. Friends and even people she didn't know were messaging her saying, "Is that you in the video?" Or "You made me cry with your playing." She replied to a few, then stopped when she saw a message from an unfamiliar number. It said, "This is the train station manager. We'd like to invite both of you back for a public performance this weekend." Her heart jumped. She hadn't expected that. Without hesitating, she replied, "I'd love to, but I don't know how to reach him." The manager responded, "We're trying to find him too. Don't worry, we'll contact you both soon," she smiled. The thought of seeing him again, the man whose music had reawakened her love for piano, made her feel strangely excited. 2 days later, Harold received a letter at his small apartment. It was hand-delivered, written neatly on official paper from the train station. "Dear Mr. Bennett, we are honored to invite you to perform once again at the station this Saturday. The public loved your performance and we would be delighted if you could join us, along with the young woman who played beside you, for a special music event." Harold read it twice, his eyes misting over. Then he smiled. "Well," he said softly, "I suppose it's time to play again." He looked over at his old sheet music piled on the small piano in his living room. Dust covered the top of it, but the keys still worked. He sat down and began to practice, slowly at first, then more confidently. His fingers were stiff, but his heart felt young again. Each note reminded him why he had fallen in love with music all those years ago. And somewhere across the city, Emily was doing the same, practicing the same song, unaware that soon they would meet again. This time not as strangers, but as two souls connected by a single melody that had found its way back into both their lives. Saturday arrived with the kind of golden morning that made the city look calm and full of hope. The sky was clear, the air was cool, and the soft sound of traffic mixed with birdsong. Inside the big city train station, workers were setting up chairs, microphones, and lights around the same piano that had started everything a few days earlier. The small corner of the station, once quiet and ignored, now had a banner hanging above it. It read, "Live Music Moment, a celebration of heart and harmony." Dozens of people were already arriving. Some had seen the viral video online and wanted to witness the performance in person. Others were just travelers, but when they saw the setup, they decided to stay. The air buzzed with quiet excitement. At the edge of the station, the old man stood, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. He had arrived early, not wanting to cause any fuss. His clothes were neat, his shoes polished, and he had even trimmed his hair that morning. His heart beat fast, but not from fear, from something closer to gratitude. The manager of the station spotted him right away and hurried over. "Mr. Bennett, we're so glad you came," he said warmly. "Everyone's been waiting to meet you." Harold smiled humbly. "Thank you for inviting me," he said. "It's a bit of a surprise, all this attention." The manager chuckled. "Well, sir, you've become a bit of a celebrity. Millions of people have watched you play." Harold shook his head in disbelief. "I never thought that would happen. I was just playing a little tune." The manager patted his shoulder. Sometimes a little tune is all it takes to move the world. A few minutes later, he was guided to a small seating area where another chair was waiting. The manager smiled. "You won't be performing alone today. She'll be here soon." Harold's heart warmed instantly. "The young lady?" he asked softly. "Yes," the manager said. "She confirmed she'd come." Harold nodded. "Good, I was hoping she would." He sat down and waited, watching the crowd grow. Families, students, elderly couples, even a few children sat close together. Some carried small flowers, some held phones ready to record. The piano, freshly polished, shone under the lights. Minutes passed, and then the sound of a rolling suitcase echoed from the hallway. Harold looked up. There she was, Emily, walking toward him with a bright, nervous smile. Her hair was tied back neatly, and she wore a light-colored dress with a simple jacket. She looked surprised to see how many people were there. When their eyes met, she smiled wider and hurried over. "I didn't think there'd be this many people," she said, her voice half a laugh, half a whisper. Harold chuckled softly. "Neither did I. I guess we made quite a scene last time." She laughed too. The sound eased both their nerves. The manager walked up to the microphone and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Today we welcome two musicians who reminded us all that music still has the power to connect hearts. The crowd clapped warmly. Cameras flashed and phones lifted. The manager continued. Please welcome back our wonderful guests, Mr. Bennett and Miss Emily. The applause grew louder. Harold looked at Emily and said quietly, "Shall we?" She nodded, taking her place beside him on the piano bench. For a few seconds they just sat there side by side, as the crowd fell silent. Then Harold leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "You start this time." Emily looked surprised. "Me?" He nodded with a soft smile. "You carried the song when I couldn't. You should begin it." She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys. The familiar melody began again, the one that had brought them together. At first it was soft, almost fragile, like a whisper. But as she played, her confidence grew. Her fingers moved gracefully, each note flowing into the next like a gentle river. Harold joined in, his hands moving over the lower keys, adding depth to her melody. Together they created something new. Not just a repeat of the old tune, but a duet filled with balance and harmony. The sound rose, filled the station, and wrapped around everyone present. The music spoke of time, loss, and rediscovery. It told a story without needing any words. The story of two people from different worlds who had met by chance but shared something deeply human. People in the audience watched with wide eyes. Some smiled, others wiped tears from their faces. The guard from that first day stood at the back, his arms crossed but his eyes glistening. When the final note came, it lingered beautifully, fading slowly into silence. Then the crowd erupted into applause. Harold and Emily looked at each other, both smiling, both a little emotional. "That was perfect," Harold said quietly. Emily shook her head. "It was real," she said softly. They stood up together, bowing slightly as the audience continued clapping. Cameras flashed again. A little girl in the front row held up a drawing of a piano and waved it toward them. After the performance, people gathered around to talk, to thank them, to take photos. But for Harold, the noise of the crowd blurred away. All he could feel was the quiet joy in his chest, the feeling that his music had finally reached people again. One of the organizers approached him and said, "Mr. Bennett, there's someone on the phone who'd like to speak to you. A music foundation saw your video and wants to invite you to perform at an upcoming charity concert." Harold's eyes widened. "Me? Are you sure?" The organizer laughed. "Quite sure. They said your music touched their hearts." He felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent years believing his time had passed, that the world had moved on. But now, standing there with people clapping for him, he realized it wasn't too late. Emily, watching from a few steps away, smiled proudly. She could see the light in his eyes, the same spark she'd seen when he played that first day. When the event ended and the crowd began to leave, Emily stayed behind to help him pack up. "That was beautiful," she said softly. "You looked so happy playing again." He smiled, his eyes kind. It felt like coming home. They walked toward the exit together, the sound of distant trains echoing behind them. Outside, the sky was turning a deep orange, the kind that made everything look warm and gentle. They stopped for a moment near the stairs. "I still can't believe all this happened," Emily said, shaking her head. "It feels like a dream." Harold chuckled. "Sometimes life gives us small miracles when we least expect them." She looked at him thoughtfully. "You know," she said, "when I was little, I had a piano teacher who used to say something similar. He always told me that music should come from the heart, not the hands." Harold turned to her, his expression softening. "That's what I used to tell my students too." Emily froze. "You were a teacher?" He nodded. "For many years. I taught at the community school, then at a small conservatory. That's where I wrote that song." Her eyes widened. "Wait, what school?" He told her the name. She stared at him in disbelief. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "That's where I took my first piano lessons when I was 7. My teacher's name was Mr. Bennett." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Harold smiled slowly. "You were in my class?" Emily nodded, laughing in surprise. "You were the one who taught me that line, about playing from the heart. I wrote it in my music book and never forgot it." Harold's eyes glistened. "So that's why the melody felt familiar to you," he said softly. "You must have heard me play it back then." Emily nodded, still amazed. "I guess I did. It must have stayed somewhere in my memory all these years." They both stood there smiling, the world moving quietly around them. The coincidence felt too perfect to be random, as if life had planned this reunion through music. "I guess it's true," she said gently. "Music really does find its way back." Harold nodded. "It always does." As they said goodbye that evening, neither of them felt like strangers anymore. They promised to stay in touch, and for the first time in years, Harold felt a sense of purpose again. When he got home that night, he placed his bag by the door, sat at his old piano, and played the song once more. But this time he played it differently, fuller, richer, alive with new meaning. Outside, the city lights shimmered, and though no one else was there to hear it, Harold knew that somewhere, the same melody was being played again, by a young woman who had once been his student, now his friend carrying his music into the world again. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of that train station performance refused to fade. The video kept spreading online, gathering millions of views. People from different countries wrote messages under it. Some said it reminded them of their grandparents. Others said it made them cry in the best way. Many said it brought hope back into their hearts. Harold never expected any of this. He didn't even have social media before the video went viral. One of his neighbors helped him set up an account just so he could read the messages. At first he was shy about it, but soon he found himself spending quiet evenings scrolling through the comments. There were people saying things like, "This man's music healed something in me." Others wrote, "I want to start playing piano again." Sometimes, he'd sit in his small living room reading those words with misty eyes. It felt strange in the best way to be seen again after so many years of silence. One morning his phone rang. The voice on the other end introduced herself as a coordinator from a charity foundation that supported music programs for underprivileged children. She said she had watched the video and wanted to invite him to perform at their annual concert. "At my age?" Harold chuckled softly. The woman laughed warmly. "That's exactly why we want you. You remind people that music never grows old." He hesitated for a second. The idea of standing on a big stage again felt overwhelming. But then he thought about that day at the station, the crowd clapping and the young woman beside him, the student who had unknowingly carried his music for years. He smiled to himself. "All right," he said finally. "I'll do it." The day of the concert arrived faster than he expected. The event was being held in a large theater, its seats filled with people from every background. Musicians, families, students, everyone had come to celebrate music's power to connect hearts. When Harold walked backstage, he saw familiar faces. Emily was already there, helping tune one of the pianos. When she noticed him, her face lit up. "You made it," she said, walking over to hug him. "I almost didn't," he teased. "My nerves tried to talk me out of it." She laughed softly. "Don't worry. Once your fingers touch the keys, everything else will disappear. You taught me that, remember?" He smiled, remembering those classroom days long ago. Before the concert began, they sat together for a few minutes, quietly going over the piece they would play. It wasn't just his old melody anymore. They had changed parts of it, added new chords, and woven both of their styles together. It felt like a conversation between generations. When the announcer finally called their names, the lights dimmed. Harold took a deep breath as he stepped onto the stage beside Emily. The applause that greeted them was gentle but full of warmth. The theater lights were bright, but somehow the moment felt peaceful. The piano sat in the center of the stage, gleaming under the spotlights. Harold looked at it and smiled softly. He whispered, "Ready?" Emily nodded. "Always." They sat down side by side. For a second, everything was still. Then the first note rang out, slow, deep, and filled with memory. The music began like a whisper, then slowly grew stronger. It was the same melody that had started it all, but now it carried a different energy. It wasn't just a story of rediscovery. It was a story of connection, of how something forgotten could bloom again in another soul. Harold's hands moved gracefully, every touch deliberate and full of feeling. Emily played the higher notes with soft precision, her face calm but glowing. Together, their playing created a kind of harmony that didn't just fill the theater. It seemed to reach beyond it. In the audience, people sat quietly, listening with full attention. Some closed their eyes, others leaned forward. A few whispered to each other, saying how rare it was to feel music this deeply. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Then suddenly applause erupted, loud and heartfelt, echoing through the hall. People stood clapping, cheering. Harold looked at Emily, smiling with quiet pride. She smiled back, tears glimmering in her eyes. They bowed together. The moment felt timeless. After the concert, they were surrounded by people who wanted to talk, take photos, and express thanks. Reporters came forward asking questions, but Harold didn't say much. He wasn't thinking about fame or attention. What filled his mind was the feeling of peace, the kind that only comes when you know you've done something that matters.